So I think obviously one of the defining experiences of college is getting a chance to think about your identity, whether it's a cultural identity or what have you. And so for me, I would say that the diversity that I saw in Harvard was along the lines of different interests, different experiences, and different personalities. I mean, for sure, we had a fair number of international students, maybe less of a spread from socioeconomic backgrounds. But for me, the most interesting opportunity was to meet people who just had different interests and maybe were not necessarily people that I normally would have hung out with or I would have been friends with. So,
but certainly, I think for me, what I wanted to define myself by, especially after I stopped rowing, which was how I primarily, the affinity group I surrounded myself with was athletes, and they definitely throughout my time at Harvard continued to be some of my closest friends, despite the fact I wasn't in kind of varsity sports anymore. I didn't join any sort of cultural ethnicity, those sorts of affinity groups. So I tended toward common interests. So I did the Global Alliance for Africa, which was focused on initiatives on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, both educational, health related, and so that I spent a lot of time on. And Model UN, which I really liked, both kind of in substance and socially. It was kind of equal parts both. There were a lot of international people. It had a pretty kind of diverse group in that sense, in terms of views and everything like that. So I feel like I drew different experiences from my different kind of extracurricular stuff.
I was involved with a number of groups. I'd say I did join a couple of the kind of more cultural focused social groups. So I mean there were a number of those, and by virtue of being an Asian American at Harvard and identifying myself in some ways with that group, I definitely joined those and interacted with those folks. But I would say that I also did a lot of other stuff that wasn't necessarily defined by that. So whether it was my big passion was music. So whether it's working in they had a recording studio in one of the dorms that I ended up being the president of. Whether it's kind of house affiliated, so dorm affiliated things where you kind of get your house spirit, sports, and all those sorts of events associated with the house. I'd say like I did a decent job of spreading my interests or my activities across all those different types of groups. So to the question of whether certain types of organizations kind of pigeonhole you into an identity, and it's not just cultural. I think it's just any type of group, whether it's the sports group or whatever groups you have. I would say that they do kind of. There's a pressure once you join them to develop your circle of friends primarily around that interest, whether it's cultural or whatever. But I think it's up to the individual to make sure that the reason you're joining that is because that's a part of who you are and that's something you're interested in. But that's just one part, and so it's important for the individual to kind of make the effort to develop their circle of friends and their network outside of that. And that applies not just to the groups that I was a part of, but just I think everything. So being an economics major, the 6 or 7 folks that I lived with were all economics / applied math kind of majors. So we all kind of studied the same thing. Maybe 70% of them were Asian, and the strong majority of them went on to work in finance afterwards. So as a group, not just based on culture, but on sort of values and interests and all that sort of stuff, the people that I lived with and spent the most time with all sort of had one way of looking at the world. And that's part of the reasons why we were friends. But in retrospect, I think being able to have friends outside of that was important as well, and maybe something I didn't do as good of a job at. Going back, I would probably change that. I think that there is kind of pressure to be in a certain type of group and kind of identify yourself with a certain set of values. And the important thing about college is really trying to stretch yourself and outside of that, and learning from that.
Yeah, I definitely, on a slightly different note, I was really focused on probably my freshman and sophomore years on kind of having this extensive base of friendships, which is one approach. And I then realized in my junior and senior years, I really just want to focus on the people that I like, and that happened to be kind of my roommates, and I was in a slightly different situation where we were all incredibly different. We actually lived together all 4 years. I guess the roommate assignment people did a great job. But I was kind of focused on the social good and impact and kind of international, and my another one, she was black and was a dancer and did a lot of dance stuff and created her own major. Another girl was from the Upper West Side and kind of urban, and she did biology but just like hilarious and make sex jokes all the time. And then the third one was Junior Miss North Carolina and was just kind of like totally effusive and bubbly. So we all had very different personalities and very different academic interests, and it worked out really well because of those differences, I think. But kind of we were all on the same page.